In the vast blue skies over North Africa, February 1st, 1943, a young American bomber crew prepared for yet another dangerous mission. They had flown dozens of times before, across deserts, over enemy lines, through flak and fire. But on that morning, nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen. Their aircraft, a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress, was known simply as All-American, a proud name painted in bold white letters across her olive-drab nose. She belonged to the 414th Bomb Squadron, part of the 97th Bomb Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces. These men were barely in their 20s. Most of them had left behind farms, schools, or small hometowns scattered across America. Now they were part of one of the most dangerous air campaigns of the war, targeting German forces entrenched in Tunisia. The B-17 was an engineering marvel of its time. 4 powerful Wright Cyclone engines roared like thunder as she climbed into the African morning sky. The Flying Fortress was famous for her toughness. She could take hits and still bring her crew home. But even a fortress has its limits. Inside, the crew went about their routine in silence. The pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, sat in the left seat, a steady, determined man. Beside him, co-pilot Lieutenant Pappy Eaton, older than most of the crew, his calm voice guiding the younger men. Behind them, the navigator, Lieutenant Harry G. Nielsen, studied maps and wind directions. The bombardier, Lieutenant Ralph Burbridge, double-checked the bomb site, waiting for the target coordinates. In the rear compartments, gunners manned their stations. Each man isolated, wrapped in the roar of engines and the cold air streaming through the fuselage. They were professionals now. Each man knew his duty. Each had already seen death in the skies above North Africa. That day's target was a German-controlled harbor near Bizerte, Tunisia. A cluster of docks, ships, and anti-aircraft guns, all crucial to the Axis supply lines. It would be a routine bombing run, or so they thought. As they neared the target, black puffs of flak exploded all around them. The crew felt the bomber shudder as fragments tore into the fuselage. Then came the fighters. German Messerschmitt, Bf-109s, and Italian Machi fighters swooped in, their engines screaming as they attacked the formation. Tracer rounds streaked through the air like burning comets. "All American, bandits at 3 o'clock!" shouted the tail gunner over the intercom. The guns of the Flying Fortress opened up. The deep, rhythmic thunder of 50-caliber Brownings filled the air. For several minutes, the sky was chaos. Dozens of bombers, each with 10 men aboard, were locked in deadly combat. Shell casings rattled across the floor. The smell of cordite filled the cabin. The All-American stayed tight in formation, protecting her neighbors. Her gunners claimed 2 fighters in those frantic moments. But as the formation began to turn for home, one last enemy fighter broke through. It was a twin-engine German Messerschmitt, Bf-110, heavily armed and flying directly toward the formation from below. Its pilot, perhaps desperate or enraged, lined up on All-American and opened fire. Cannon shells tore through the bomber's belly and tail section. Then, just as he passed underneath, the Bf-110 rose sharply, straight into the All-American's right wing and tail assembly. There was a deafening impact. Metal screamed. The bomber lurched violently. The German fighter disintegrated on contact. Pieces of its fuselage and wings slashed through the B-17's body like blades. Inside All-American, everything went silent for a moment. The crew thought they'd been cut in half. The tail section, the very end of the bomber, was hanging on by a few twisted pieces of metal and cables. Incredibly, the stabilizers still held. The bomber was literally broken open, daylight streaming through a gaping wound in her fuselage. From the outside, she looked as if she had already been destroyed. And yet, she was still flying. Lieutenant Bragg fought to keep control. The yoke felt heavy and unresponsive. Over the intercom, he could hear shouts from the back. The tail gunner was still alive. He was trapped in what was now a half-separated section of the plane, hanging in mid-air. "Hold on, we're going to make it back," Bragg yelled. The crew couldn't believe it. They'd all seen B-17s fall apart from less damage than this. But somehow, the All-American was holding together, defying physics, defying death itself. When the formation reached friendly airspace, the pilots of nearby bombers couldn't believe what they were seeing. The All-American was flying in two pieces, the tail section twisting in the wind, connected only by a few cables. Crewmen from other aircraft took photographs in disbelief, thinking there was no way she'd ever make it back to base. But she did. Against all odds, the All-American and her crew would soon make one of the most legendary returns in aviation history. And the photographs taken that day would become some of the most iconic images of World War II aviation. What happened next, how they landed, and how every man survived is a story that defies imagination. But before that miracle landing came a long flight home, with every minute a fight to stay alive. In the next part, we'll follow the All-American's crippled return journey and the impossible teamwork that kept her in the air. The bomber limped through the skies, broken yet unyielding. Inside, the men of the All-American could hear the wind howling through the open wounds in her fuselage. Cold air whipped through the cabin, tearing at loose cables and shredded insulation. Every vibration felt like it could be their last. Lieutenant Bragg held the control column tightly, trying to feel the pulse of the aircraft beneath his hands. She was wounded, bleeding oil and fuel, but somehow still alive. He could sense every tremor, every shudder, every sound that wasn't supposed to be there. Behind him, the crew checked on one another. They couldn't move much. The floor near the tail was ripped apart, with jagged metal edges hanging like teeth. One wrong step could mean falling straight into the sky below. The tail gunner, Sergeant Sam T. Alcorn, was still in his position, but barely. His section of the plane was hanging on by only a few twisted pieces of metal. He could see daylight both above and below him, and the horizon swayed unnaturally as the bomber fought to stay level. Every time the aircraft hit turbulence, he thought it would tear apart completely. The radio operator tried to send a message, but the set was half dead. Static hissed through the headphones. He could only manage short bursts, coordinates, altitude, their status. Returning, heavy damage. Tail nearly gone. No one knew if the message was received. The formation had left them behind. Most of the other bombers, though damaged, still had speed. The All-American lagged behind, her engines straining to keep her in the air. For the first time, they were alone. Far below stretched the empty desert, rolling dunes and patches of barren rock. If they went down here, there would be no help, no rescue, no chance. But Lieutenant Bragg refused to give up. He spoke calmly through the intercom, his voice steady, almost unnaturally so. "Hang tight, boys. She's still got wings. Let's bring her home." Each man focused on his station. The engineer checked the engines again and again, praying they wouldn't overheat. The navigator plotted a direct course to their base in Algeria. The gunners stayed alert, scanning the skies for enemy fighters, though all of them knew. One more attack, and it would be over. As the hours passed, something remarkable happened. The All-American kept flying. The airframe groaned and flexed, but the controls responded. The stabilizers, those few twisted pieces of metal still connecting the tail to the body, continued to hold. One of the waist gunners later said it was like watching a bird with its wings half torn off, yet still determined to fly. He could see the horizon through the gaping holes in the fuselage. He could see the tail gunner sitting alone, swaying gently, his section moving separately from the rest of the plane like it was alive on its own. Every man aboard knew what was at stake. If the tail section broke loose, it would take the rear gunner with it and throw the bomber into a deadly spin. So they decided to do something few air crews ever attempted. They tied parachute cords and oxygen hoses between the main fuselage and the broken tail, hoping it would keep it from twisting too far. It was desperate, almost absurd, but it worked. When they finally reached the North African coast, the men saw friendly territory below. They had made it out of enemy airspace. But now came the hardest part: landing. Lieutenant Bragg radioed ahead to their base, describing their condition. The ground crew could hardly believe it. They prepared emergency vehicles and medical teams, expecting the worst. As the All-American approached the airfield, pilots and mechanics poured out of hangars to watch. They could see her silhouette in the distance. And then, as she came closer, they realized the rumors were true. The tail was nearly detached, the fuselage ripped open. It looked impossible that such an aircraft could still be in flight. Men on the ground stood in silence as the flying fortress descended, flaps barely working, engines coughing. Inside, the crew prepared for the landing of their lives. There was no way to know if the tail would hold once they touched the ground. If it broke away too soon, the bomber would cartwheel across the runway. Bragg lined her up perfectly, talking the crew through every step. "Hold tight. Stay at your stations. Don't move." The runway came into view. He eased the throttles back. The aircraft trembled violently as the wheels touched the ground. For a terrifying moment, it looked like she would break apart completely. But somehow, miraculously, she didn't. The All-American rolled to a stop, engines sputtering to silence. The tail section sagged, almost touching the ground, but it never fell away. They had made it. Every single man aboard survived. When the crew climbed out, the full extent of the damage became clear. The bomber looked like she had been sliced open by a giant blade. Her rear fuselage was shredded, her tail section barely connected. Photographers rushed to capture the sight. The images spread through Allied bases around the world, proof of the flying fortress's strength and the courage of her crew. Mechanics later said it was a miracle that the control cables hadn't snapped. If even one of them had broken, the All-American would never have made it home. That day, the crew became legends. They had lived through something that defied explanation. Not just skill, but luck, faith, and sheer willpower. For them, the name All-American would never just be paint on a plane again. It would be a symbol of resilience, of ordinary men facing the impossible and winning. The dust had barely settled on the airfield when the crew of the All-American climbed down from their bomber. Ground personnel stood frozen in disbelief. No one had ever seen anything like it. The rear of the plane was torn open, twisted metal and cables exposed like the veins of a wounded giant. The tail, impossibly, still clung to the fuselage, tilted to one side, barely hanging on. The men who had flown her were covered in dust and sweat, their flight suits torn and blackened from oil and smoke. Yet each of them was alive, bruised, exhausted, but standing. For a long moment, no one said a word. The only sound was the ticking of cooling engines and the soft desert wind sweeping across the runway. Then, slowly, applause broke out among the ground crews. Mechanics, pilots, officers, everyone who had gathered around the shattered bomber, began clapping, shaking their heads in disbelief. The crew of the All-American had done the impossible. Lieutenant Bragg tried to smile, though his hands still trembled from the hours he'd spent fighting the controls. He looked back at the plane, at the gaping hole that ran almost the entire length of her body, and whispered, "I can't believe she held together." Photographers rushed to capture the sight. Men climbed onto ladders and trucks to get the best angle of the damage. The images they took that day would soon travel across the world, printed in newspapers, pinned on barracks walls, and shown in briefings to new crews. The photos of the All-American would become living proof that the flying fortress truly lived up to its name. Within hours, word spread across the base. Other bomber crews came by to see the wreck with their own eyes. Some touched the twisted metal as if it was sacred, a relic of survival. They couldn't understand how a plane that damaged could stay airborne, let alone make a perfect landing. The mechanics later explained that two of the control cables had partially jammed during the collision. Ironically, that was what saved the bomber. Had they snapped completely, the tail would have torn free instantly, but the jam locked the structure in place just enough to keep the stabilizers aligned. A miracle of chance, precision, and sheer luck. The men of the All-American were hailed as heroes. For days afterward, officers and engineers from other units came to inspect the aircraft. Some stood silently beneath her tattered tail, shaking their heads. One general reportedly said, "If you ever need proof of what this plane can do, this is it." In the days that followed, the crew was debriefed again and again. How had they kept her in the air? What had they felt when they saw the tail hanging by a thread? Their answers were simple: teamwork, faith, and discipline. They had done their jobs, each man trusting the other completely. That, they said, was what made the difference between life and death. The photographs of the All-American were soon sent home to the Arnant, United States. They appeared in Life magazine and other wartime publications under headlines that called the B-17 the plane that refused to die. For families back home, the images became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in chaos, courage could prevail. The All-American herself was beyond repair. Her airframe was too badly damaged to ever fly again. But instead of being scrapped immediately, she was left on the airfield for a time, serving as a training example for maintenance crews. Men walked through her open fuselage, studying the damage, marveling at how the rivets and spars had held just long enough. For the crew, life went on. They were assigned to new aircraft and continued flying missions over North Africa and Italy. Each time they climbed into a bomber, they carried the memory of that day and the sound of metal tearing in the wind. Some of them would later say that no flight ever felt quite the same after the All-American. After the war, most of the crew returned home. They went back to ordinary lives, teaching, farming, working in factories. But the story of their flight followed them. Every few years, they would receive letters from strangers thanking them for what their survival had meant. For many veterans, the All-American became more than a plane. She became a legend. In later decades, historians and pilots would still speak of her. They would point to those grainy black and white photos and shake their heads in awe. In an age before computer design and modern composites, a handful of young men had kept a shattered machine in the air through sheer will. The All-American never flew again, but her legacy lived on in every B-17 that returned from battle with holes in its wings or engines on fire. She became a symbol of endurance, of the unbreakable bond between a crew and their machine. Even now, 80 years later, when historians speak of the Flying Fortress, they still mention her name with reverence, because the All-American was more than just metal and rivets. She was courage made visible. The proof that even when the world breaks apart, the human spirit can still hold everything together. News of the All-American's miraculous survival spread faster than anyone expected. Within days, the photographs taken on that dusty airfield in Algeria reached London, New York, and Washington. They appeared on the desks of generals, in newspapers across the United States, and even in briefing rooms where young pilots trained for their first missions. The images told a story that words could barely describe. A bomber, ripped nearly in half, still flying. A tail section hanging by cables, and yet every man aboard alive. To a nation still reeling from heavy losses in Europe and the Pacific, it was a message that resonated deeply. It said, if this plane can hold together, maybe we can too. The U.S. Army Air Forces quickly recognized the power of that message. They turned the All-American into a symbol of resilience, featuring her in posters and pamphlets distributed to air bases around the world. The phrase, "the plane that refused to die," became a quiet anthem for crews heading into the unknown. At training bases across America, instructors showed the photos during briefings. They told new pilots, "Look at this. Look what a B-17 can take and still bring you home." For many, those images gave a sliver of hope, something to hold on to when the odds seemed impossible. But for the men who had actually lived it, the fame was strange. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg and his crew were proud, of course, but they were also humble. They knew luck had played a part. They knew many other crews had not been so fortunate. When journalists tried to paint them as heroes, they often deflected the praise. They said they were just doing their jobs. Still, they couldn't deny the pride they felt each time they saw those photographs. Proof of what teamwork, courage, and discipline could achieve. The bomber itself, too damaged to fly, was eventually stripped for parts. But before that happened, engineers studied every inch of her. They analyzed how the metal had bent, where the rivets had held, and how the tail structure had managed to stay attached under such strain. The lessons learned from the All-American influenced later reinforcements to the B-17's design, making the already durable flying fortress even stronger. As the war dragged on, the story of the All-American continued to circulate. Letters poured in from families who said it gave them comfort. Some said that when they felt fear for their sons or husbands flying overseas, they thought of that photograph, that wounded bomber still in the sky, refusing to fall. By 1944, the All-American had become legend. Her name was referenced in speeches, her story told in military newsletters and on radio broadcasts. Even as newer aircraft like the B-29 began to appear, the tale of that single B-17 flying half-destroyed across enemy territory never lost its power. In many ways, she became a reflection of the American spirit at that time, battered, scarred, but unbroken. Every dent in her fuselage became a metaphor for survival. Every cable that held her together symbolized the fragile yet enduring bonds between the men who flew her. After the war, the All-American's photographs found a new life in museums and aviation books. Students of history would stare at the images and try to imagine what it must have felt like to sit in that shaking metal shell, watching the earth spin below, knowing that one more vibration might tear it apart. For decades, veterans of the 97th Bomb Group spoke about her at reunions. When they told the story, their voices often softened near the end. They didn't talk much about fear or danger. Instead, they spoke of trust, of how 10 young men had believed in each other enough to keep a shattered machine in the air. That, they said, was what kept them alive. As the years passed, most of the crew lived long, quiet lives. Many never considered themselves famous. But when their children or grandchildren asked about the war, they would sometimes bring out the faded photograph, the one showing the All-American flying home with her tail nearly gone. They would look at it for a long time before speaking, and then they'd say, "We shouldn't have made it, but we did." The legacy of the All-American endures even today. In aviation museums and veterans' halls, her story is still told, not as a tale of machinery, but as a testament to human resolve. Because behind every bullet hole and twisted piece of metal was something far stronger, the will to live and the belief that giving up was never an option. 80 years later, those black and white images still inspire awe. They remind us that courage isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet persistence in the face of the impossible. And somewhere, in the vast memory of the skies over North Africa, the All-American still flies, broken, battered, but forever unbowed. When the war finally ended in 1945, the men who had once flown the All-American were scattered across the world. Some stayed in the service a little longer, helping to ferry planes back to the United States. Others returned home immediately, stepping off troop ships into a country that was celebrating victory and grieving at the same time. For Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, the pilot who had fought the controls that day over Tunisia, the end of the war felt strangely quiet. After years of noise, chaos, and survival, peace seemed unreal. He returned to his hometown in Alabama, where the fields stretched wide and the air no longer smelled of oil or gunpowder. Neighbors called him a hero, but he would only smile and say, "I just brought my boys home." His co-pilot, Pappy Eaton, the older, steady voice in the cockpit, found it hardest to adjust. He had spent his adult life teaching young men how to fly and how to stay alive. When he returned to civilian life, he became a flight instructor, often showing students the famous photograph of the All-American. He would say, "This is why you never give up on a plane. As long as the wings are still up there, you fight to bring her home." The navigator, Harry Nielsen, went back to college, earning a degree in engineering. He later helped design parts for civilian aircraft, building in the kind of strength and reliability he had once trusted his own life to. Friends said that he never spoke much about the war, but he always kept a framed photo of a B-17 on his desk. As the 1950s and 60s passed, the story of the All-American faded quietly from the headlines. New wars came, new machines, new heroes. But among the community of bomber veterans, her name was still sacred. At reunions, old flyers would trade stories about impossible flights and near misses, and eventually someone would mention her. The plane that came home in 2 pieces. When they spoke of her, they didn't talk about tactics or weaponry. They talked about trust, how each man had done his job without question, believing that the others were doing theirs. That bond, they said, was stronger than steel. It was what held the plane together when metal alone could not. In the late 1970s, a journalist researching the history of the 97th Bomb Group rediscovered the All-American story. He tracked down surviving crew members, many of whom hadn't spoken to each other in decades. The reunion was emotional. Some of the men had gray hair now, some walked with canes, but when they met again, it was as if no time had passed. They gathered around a table covered in photographs, the same black and white images that had once circled the world. Someone passed around an old coffee-stained mission log. Bragg's neat handwriting listed the date, February 1st, 1943. The target, Bizerte. And in the margin, a small note added later, "Returned safely. By miracle." When the journalist asked them what they remembered most, their answers were simple. The wind howling through the holes in the fuselage, the way the tail swayed in the air, held by nothing but faith and metal. The silence after the landing, when no one could believe they were still alive. Ralph Burbridge, the bombardier, said it best. People call it luck, but it was more than that. It was 10 men who refused to give up on each other. The resulting article brought the story of the All-American back into public view. Magazines published retrospectives, television segments followed, and aviation museums began displaying her photographs again. Younger generations who had never lived through the war were stunned by what they saw. Even in the jet age, when technology had advanced beyond imagination, the All-American still represented something timeless, the strength of human determination. In the 1980s, a model of the All-American was added to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum archives. It wasn't a full aircraft, but a detailed replica made by volunteers, each rivet placed by hand according to the photos. Veterans visiting the exhibit would stand quietly before it. Some would reach out and touch the model's torn tail, whispering to themselves, remembering what it felt like to hold a shaking yoke over enemy skies. For their families, the legacy meant pride mixed with humility. Children and grandchildren grew up hearing the story, not as a tale of war, but as a lesson in endurance. That even when everything seems broken, there's still a way to make it home. One of the crew's sons later said, "My father never talked much about fear, but whenever life got hard, he'd look at that old photo of the All-American and say, if that plane could stay in the air, then we can get through this too." Over time, the names of the crew faded from memory, but the story remained. It was retold in documentaries, books, and veterans' interviews. Each version ended the same way, with awe. Because no matter how often people studied the photos, no one could fully explain how the plane had stayed intact. Some said it was luck. Some said it was engineering, but those who were there, those who heard the roar of the engines and the scream of the wind, knew better. It was heart, it was faith, it was the unbreakable bond between a crew and their machine. And even though the All-American herself no longer exists, her story continues to fly. Passed from one generation to the next, carried on the wings of memory, courage, and the enduring belief that nothing is impossible when you refuse to fall. By the time the 1980s arrived, the world had changed beyond recognition. Jetliners crossed oceans in hours, satellites circled the Earth, and new wars were being fought with precision technology that the crews of 1943 could hardly have imagined. And yet, among veterans and aviation historians, one aircraft still symbolized the courage and endurance of an entire generation: the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. To most people, it was more than a machine. It was a shape burned into memory. The broad wings, the glass nose, the 4 roaring engines. When people saw that silhouette in old photographs or documentaries, they didn't just see aluminum and rivets. They saw homecomings that should never have happened. They saw bravery at 25,000 feet. And above all, they saw hope. The All-American had become one of the brightest symbols of that legacy. Her story had been told and retold until it became part of the mythology of World War II aviation. Not just a single plane, but a representation of what the Flying Fortress stood for. The B-17's reputation had begun long before the All-American's flight. When it first took to the skies in 1935, the press called it a flying fortress because it seemed untouchable. A fortress of steel and courage carried on wings. It could fly thousands of miles, take heavy damage, and still make it home. Crews trusted it like a living companion. They often gave their bombers names, painted pin-up girls, or hometown slogans on their noses, and spoke about them the way sailors once spoke of ships, with affection, respect, even love. The All-American embodied everything that myth promised. Her survival became a story told in every mess hall and every pilot's tent across Europe and Africa. Some crews even carried her photo with them for luck, believing that if she could make it home in 2 pieces, maybe they could too. To the engineers at Boeing, her flight was a triumph of design. To the men who flew her, it was proof that courage and technology together could defy fate. And to the families waiting back home, it was a reminder that miracles still existed, even in war. In the years that followed, other flying fortresses earned their own fame. Memphis Belle, 909, Shoo Shoo Baby. Each had its own story of survival, but none quite captured the raw, impossible image that the All-American did. Because hers wasn't just about strength. It was about fragility, too. She had been torn open, exposed, and yet somehow endured. That duality, strength through vulnerability, was what made her unforgettable. In the chaos of combat, she became a quiet metaphor for humanity itself. Fragile, breakable, but capable of extraordinary resilience. Even decades later, the All-American's image still appeared in books, museums, and documentaries about the war. Every time, viewers reacted the same way. Disbelief turning into admiration. You could study the photographs for hours, tracing the torn metal and the dangling cables, and still not understand how she held together. It was as if physics itself had bent to allow her one last flight home. By the 1990s, a new generation of historians began interviewing the children and grandchildren of B-17 crews. They wanted to know why, after all these years, stories like the All-Americans still mattered. The answers were surprisingly universal. Because, they said, these weren't just war stories. They were human stories. They were about teamwork, faith, friendship, and the kind of courage that never makes the headlines. They were about young men who faced impossible odds and still chose to climb into the sky every morning. And they were about machines that became symbols, not of destruction, but of endurance. One historian wrote that the All-American didn't just fly home. She carried the belief that survival was possible when everything else said it wasn't. That line would later appear engraved on a memorial plaque at a small airfield museum in Alabama, near where Lieutenant Bragg had once lived. Visitors still stop there today, looking at the photo of that broken tail and reading the words. They often stand in silence. Some whisper, "How did she make it?" And the truth is, no one will ever fully know. What makes the story endure isn't the metal or the mechanics, it's the meaning. The All-American reminds people that even when life is torn apart, it can still hold together. That strength doesn't always look perfect or polished. Sometimes it looks bent, scarred, and barely holding on. But it flies anyway. And that is why, long after the engines fell silent and the crews grew old, the legend of the All-American continues to soar, not just across the skies of history, but in the hearts of everyone who hears her story. As the new century dawned, the roar of radial engines had mostly faded from the skies. Jetliners now traced silent white lines across the clouds, their passengers unaware that, decades earlier, the same heavens had once echoed with the deep thunder of four-engine bombers. But for a handful of people scattered across the world, the legacy of the All-American and the Flying Fortress was not forgotten. In small hangars and workshops, retired mechanics and aviation enthusiasts began restoring the few surviving B-17s still left on Earth. They called themselves caretakers, not owners. Every rivet, every cable was treated like a sacred artifact. Many of these men and women had grown up listening to their fathers or grandfathers speak of the war, of long flights home over endless seas, of the smell of oil and cordite. For them, rebuilding a B-17 wasn't just preservation. It was communion with the past. At air shows across America and Europe, the thunder returned. Crowds would look up as a shining silver fortress appeared on the horizon, its engines beating like a slow heart. When the aircraft banked and sunlight flashed off its wings, veterans in the audience would often stand silently, hats in hand. Some wiped their eyes. For a brief moment, time folded in on itself. The same sound that once meant war now meant remembrance. One of those restored bombers carried the name 909. Another was Sentimental Journey. Each painted nose told a story, not of destruction, but of endurance and pride. And though the All-American herself was long gone, her spirit seemed to live within them. At many airfields, volunteers painted her silhouette on the walls of hangars, or displayed the famous photograph of her torn tail section beside the flight line. It had become a symbol, not only of survival, but of devotion to those who built, flew, and maintained these machines. In museums, children pressed their hands against glass cases, staring at fragments of metal labeled B-17 tail section, 97th Bomb Group. Guides would point to the image of the All-American and tell her story again. How a bomber came home against all odds, how courage could be stronger than gravity itself. For younger generations, the tale carried a strange kind of hope. Proof that even the most fragile things can endure when held together by faith and purpose. Among the families of the original crew, memory became heritage. Grandchildren of the All-American's pilots and gunners began attending reunions, bringing photo albums and faded letters. They spoke not of heroism, but of ordinary people who faced extraordinary days. One granddaughter recalled how her grandfather kept a small fragment of aluminum in his drawer, a piece cut from the wreck after the landing. He never displayed it proudly. He simply called it a reminder to stay calm when things fall apart. Stories like that began to spread online, through forums and documentary projects dedicated to aviation history. Suddenly, a new audience discovered the All-American. Young filmmakers and writers reached out to the veterans' families, asking to interview them, to record their voices before they were lost to time. The result was a wave of short films, museum exhibits, and books that connected the courage of 1943 with the curiosity of a digital generation. At one commemorative event in 2018, a restored B-17 performed a slow flyover during the reading of names from the 97th Bomb Group. As the bomber passed overhead, 4 engines rumbling through the summer air, the announcer told the crowd, "This sound once meant danger. Today, it means gratitude." Many in the audience closed their eyes and listened. For a few seconds, everyone could feel the weight of history, the echo of a time when survival itself was a victory. And somewhere in that low, steady hum, you could almost imagine the All-American among them, flying unseen, still holding together, still refusing to fall. Over the years, more B-17s have found homes in museums, where volunteers polish their skins and tell their stories to anyone willing to listen. Some aircraft still fly, maintained by passionate crews who devote their weekends to keeping those massive engines alive. When they taxi down the runway and lift off, people wave, not just to a plane, but to an idea that courage never rusts. That memory, when cared for, can keep on flying. And so, every time one of those engines starts, a little piece of the All-American takes to the air again. Her metal may be gone, but her heartbeat endures, carried forward by the hands and hearts of those who remember. Time has a way of softening the edges of history. The noise fades, the faces blur, and what remains are stories, fragments of courage that refuse to disappear. The tale of the All-American has become one of those fragments, carried through decades by voices, photographs, and the quiet awe of those who still stop to listen. When people see her picture for the first time, the tail almost torn away, the cables stretched thin against the sky, their first reaction is disbelief. Their second is wonder. Because in that one image, the chaos of war gives way to something much deeper, the endurance of the human spirit. The men who flew her are gone now. Their names live on in archives, in family stories, in fading ink on yellowed mission logs. But their legacy is larger than a date or a battle. It's the reminder that when everything is breaking apart, there's still strength to be found in holding on. To your duty, to your friends, to the belief that you can make it home. In many ways, the All-American became more than a machine. She became a mirror, reflecting who we are when tested beyond our limits. Every rivet and scar on her fuselage tells the same quiet truth. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about staying steady when fear is all you have. Engineers could never quite explain how she stayed in the air that day over Tunisia. They said the remaining metal structure shouldn't have been enough to hold. But perhaps that's the point. Sometimes what keeps things together can't be measured. It's faith, trust, and the will not to fall. The All-American story has now traveled far beyond airfields and museums. It's told in classrooms, documentaries, and books, often to people born long after the war ended. And yet it still resonates, not because of bombs or battles, but because it speaks to something universal. We've all had moments when life felt like that broken tail, hanging by threads, threatening to tear away. And like that crew, we all try to keep flying anyway. At a small museum in the American Midwest, a volunteer once said to a visitor, "She reminds us that even the things that seem destroyed can still make it home." The visitor, an old man who had flown supply missions decades earlier, nodded slowly and said, "Maybe that's what we all hope for in the end." Those words could have been spoken by anyone who has ever looked at that photograph and felt something stir, a quiet recognition that life, no matter how fragile, is worth fighting for. The story of the All-American isn't really about war at all. It's about survival. It's about connection. It's about the invisible strength that binds people together when the world around them is falling apart. And so the legend continues, not in the roar of engines, but in the hush of remembrance. Each time a restored B-17 lifts into the sky, each time a museum visitor stops to stare at that torn tail, the All-American flies again. She flies in memory, in gratitude, in the soft hum of time carrying her forward. Because she was never just metal and rivets. She was proof that hope can fly on broken wings.